Hello, everyone. Adam Fitzgerald returns to the podcast today. Adam was on recently talking about his in-depth research into the events of 9/11. I really learned a lot from that conversation, and I was left feeling hungry to go much deeper into the topic. So both Adam and I feel that we can't understand 9/11 just by looking at the day itself, the surrounding months, or even the surrounding years or decade. It's an event that has its roots in deep history. And not only that, but there were various different strands leading into it. So Adam's agreed with me to do a series of videos where he'll bring his research and knowledge gained over the past decade or more of intense study of this, and I'll come with my more superficial knowledge and ask him the kind of questions that someone with a more superficial knowledge might want to ask, and hopefully we'll produce something that is really in-depth and also accessible. So I mentioned various different strands, and the first one we're going to pick up on is the Islamic strand, the Islamic road to 9/11, if you like. Now, for some people, that's the only game in town. That's the only strand there is. 9/11 was an Islamic plot, plain and simple. No more to say about it. For other people, the Islamic aspect is so minimal, it's hardly even worth talking about, because they will see that aspect as being just a sock puppet for US and Zionist imperialism. We'll certainly get on to talking about things like US and Zionist imperialism in future episodes, but even to make that determination, to determine what this Islamic terror thing is, first have to understand the narrative of it, and that's where we're going to go. So I will ask Adam deeper questions about it, about Western collusion with radical Islam, about Western sponsorship of terrorism, why Western governments would do this kind of thing, and questions about double agents. It's certainly a world where not everyone is who they are claiming to be. But I start out asking him to give a narrative of how this more radical Islamic movement came about, what its origins are, and how we define it in the relationship to the rest of Islam.
Well, what we're talking about is the Wahhabi ideology of Islam, Islamism. The name Wahhabi Islam is named after an 18th century preacher named Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab. He would actually start this Reformation movement in Najd, which is located in the central part of Saudi Arabia even today, but at the time it was called the Emirate of Diriyah. His father, Salman ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, opposed his son's teachings, which was considered a deviation from the more contemptuous Sunni Islamic school of thought. But when Abdul Wahhab was a young man, he went to Medina to study. And what really formed this almost this far right orthodoxy of Sunni Islam, he saw foreigners visiting the Kaaba, which is the most sacred site in all of Islam. He would see that they were kissing the Dome of the Rock. He would also notice people praying at the Green Dome, which is the grave of the Prophet Muhammad. Al-Wahhab was actually horrified to see this, and he was cast out of the family when he started preaching almost this really far orthodox, this off the path ideology of this Wahhab mentality. And he was cast out of the city of Najd. He relocated to the center of Diriyah, a town which had the local emir called Muhammad ibn Saud. Here Wahhab was granted protection under Saud, who heard about the beleaguered preacher's teachings, which were under attack from local Sunni Muslims. So they decided to work together to implement Wahhab's ideologies by bringing back a more traditional form. When I say about this is that they're talking about the three generations of the Prophet Muhammad, the companions and the first generations of the companions. That's what they wanted to bring back, the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Uthul Amin. And in 1744, the alliance between the clans of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad ibn Saud was formalized, most notably during the wedding of Muhammad ibn Wahhab's daughter to Abdul Aziz, who is the son and the successor of Ibn Saud. Therefore, the descendants of Muhammad bin Saud and the descendants of Abdul Wahhab have remained closely linked even to the present day. So the Saudi state would enter this numerous transformations, leading to question if the Wahhabi ideology would survive, even under the attacks of the Ottoman Empire. But in 1901, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, the fifth generation descendant of Muhammad ibn Saud, would embark on a military campaign. And this would witness the conquest of most of the Arabian Peninsula, which in turn would eliminate the Ottoman Empire and give rise to Saudi Arabia, the nation state of Saudi Arabia. The success of Abdullah bin Saud would actually lay way for the religious institutions in the kingdom, and it was also bring forth the birth of the Sudari Seven, or the seven lines, the brotherhood of the sons of the originator Muhammad ibn Saud. It's called the Sudari Seven.
Okay, so that was an interesting thing to me when I was looking into this, that the current Saud family, who have been renamed Arabia, Saudi Arabia, about 70 years ago, you can trace them way back as tribal chieftains there, 250 years, where they made this alliance with this particularly Islamic preacher. When you say Wahhabism was rejected by the Sunni Muslims of the time, how exactly was it differing? Was it more austere, more fundamentalist, more by the book? What was the conflict there in the ideologies?
Well, actually, the conflict started with the veneration of saints, praying or worshiping the dead at the graves, which is what Abdul Wahhab was set against. He thought that these were idolatrous at best, and that they were causing Muslims to commit takfir. They would consider these people to be fake Muslims, not actual traditional contemporary. Like I said, the first three generations of Muhammad and the companions he saw as the more traditional. In other words, what he was trying to imply was that the traditions of the first generations of Muhammad were to be taught either in modern day of even just today, which when you see groups like Al Qaeda or even ISIS, which would be a better example, and you see these, they're even on their physical deformity, they look barbaric, they're unclean, they commit atrocities even against Shia Muslims, which even Al Qaeda would be against, because they see this as an affront to the Prophet Muhammad. But they consider the idolatrous nature of these Shiites and these Alawite Muslims, these mystic Muslims, as something as a deviation to the true teachings of Muhammad, which was Sunni Islam. And that's what dominates the Sunni sphere today, unfortunately, because most of the Sunni Muslims that we see today are moderate Muslims, but they don't have a big voice. Unfortunately, the biggest voice comes from these Wahhab, or as they say, the Salafist movement, which is predominant in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and Indonesia and the Philippines.
Okay, so we'll talk about how we got to that place where it became predominant, but it might be helpful. I'm just trying to think of something that people, myself and people, can relate to in terms of another religion, say Christianity, that you have these Reformation movements every now and then of getting back to the fundamentals, right? Of where there's this feeling that Christianity has grown away from its essence and people have started venerating Mary or venerating saints, and there's a call back to what it actually said in the Bible and living a more biblical life. And then also at different times the want to tie that in more strongly with politics, okay, in a theocratic sense. So would that be comparable to what we're talking about here with Wahhabism?
I don't know. When it comes to Christianity, especially in the United States, during I would say the 16th or 17th centuries, you had the Spanish and the British colonies, which brought the Roman Catholicism, Northern European people who introduced Protestantism, to the northeast. You had numerous Reformation movements in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially, which would see an influx of beliefs rising from them. Protestants, you had Catholics, liberal Christianity, Christian fundamentalism, Roman Orthodoxy, Mormonism. Islam is a little bit more simpler. There's a limited number of Islamic sects, and basically just two dominating sects, which would be the Sunni and Shia ideologies themselves. They're far less to have an influx of ideologies. So Christianity, I believe, has close to like 3,000, 4,000 different sects within just the faith itself. So so you almost have this unwavering, contemptuous group of people that despise one another based upon the simple mistranslations of the King James or the New International Version, the Wycliffe, which was the first English translated Bible. But so many mistranslations of these Bibles, which led to so many differing points within Christianity itself. I think Islam sees a less problematic approach, especially in the Middle East itself and the Southeast Asia. So when it comes to the comparable problems of Christianity and Islam, I don't see it actually.
So what I'm getting at, I suppose, though, is if you want to get our heads around something like Wahhabism, trying to find something in our own experience we could compare it to, like a fundamentalist Christian preacher who might want to, like, I don't know, maybe a John Calvin figure or someone like that. You see what I mean? So people can relate to it.
Right. I hear what you're saying. Is there like a religion with a Christianity that's coincidental to Wahhabi Islam?
Just in a broad sense, just so people can get, like, I can understand that in my own society, so I can see something similar. Like,
right. Well, probably I think it would have to be Orthodox, the Orthodox Christians, because they're the literalist and they go by the Old Testament themselves. So that would be almost comparable, because if you read Exodus or Deuteronomy, you see these, barbaric practices that are no longer in practice today. But if you look at certain Orthodox preachers, especially the evangelical Republicans, some of these people want to bring back the old Judeo-Christian practices themselves. A great example would be someone like a John Hagee. John Hagee actually wants to see more of a harsher punishment for divorce. And this is a person who actually believes in the literal translation of Revelations. He wants to see, the 100.
Actually, John Hagee was the person who popped into my mind when I was thinking of the comparison. So people who don't know who John Hagee is, you have a happier life than me and Adam, I would suggest. But yes, you can look him up. So then it's the equivalent of, let's say, if a Christian fundamentalist character got very enmeshed within a government, and then that government went from ruling over a desert to ruling over the most resource-rich land in the world virtually overnight when the Saudis hit oil, right? They've heard it's been discovered in Iraq and Iran, and they start looking out into the desert. They invite an American oil company in to prospect for them, and they find it, and they find 1 trillion barrels of it or more there over the years. So suddenly these Bedouins in the desert have struck oil, and now there's all this money there to put into Wahhabism, and it starts to influence the world. So perhaps you can pick up on that story and take that as far as you want to take it. And at some point, I know we're gonna jump over to Egypt and talk about the other major factor in this equation, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. So maybe tell the Wahhabism story. I don't know if there's much of a direct relationship there with the Muslim Brotherhood, but tell the Wahhabism story as much as you want to at this point, Adam, and then we'll go on.
Well, and I would start off with Al-Wahhab would die in 1792, but the religious institution in the kingdom would remain, and it would extend from here on. I don't think even he would come to understanding of how fast this Wahhabi ideology would permeate into other Arab nation states such as Iraq and United Arab Emirates and Egypt. But because of the Saudi petrodollar becoming the poignant financial backing of the Wahhabi movement led by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, madrasas were implemented in other locations such as Pakistan, Canada, Sudan, Indonesia, Philippines, the United States over the next 100 years. But the Salafi movement would rise in Egypt in the late 19th centuries as a response to European imperialism, which would hold roots in the 18th century Wahhabi movement.
Could you just define Salafism? Because I don't think we've defined that yet as a different word.
Yeah, the Salafi movement is centered around the traditions of the Salaf, who are the first 3 generations of Muslims, that was explained before.
Equivalent of
that
Wahhabism,
includes the generations of the Prophet Muhammad, his companions, their successors, and the successors of these successors. The majority of the Salafs are basically just in the Gulf states, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. The current day Salafism has become associated with literalism, a strict approach to Islam, much like Wahhabi Islam. The Salafi Islamic movement follow the literal translations and injunctions of like Ibn Taymiyyah and his disciple Ibn Kathir. These are the people who have followed the Hanbali school of thought. Of course, Abu Ahmad ibn Hanbali was a Sunni theologian. But the Wahhabi ideology is still present today, as it was 260 years ago.
Sure, and you mean it's picking up in Egypt in the 19th century as a response to Western imperialism there?
Yes. This, if you want, this could lead into the questioning of the how it started. This Wahhabi ideology permeated into Egypt, if you want. I mean, I could go into
that. So I'm curious about that. So was it a permeation? Okay, I don't know if these are two independently arising things, or if Wahhabism was the influence for this in Egypt.
I would, well, especially Egypt. I mean, Egypt also saw almost this transition into this Arab nationalism, into this religious fundamentalist that they have the problems even today. But if you want, I'll give you a short rundown about the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood, if you wish.
Yeah, please. Yes, please do.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood originated in 1928 by an Egyptian school teacher named Hassan al-Banna. The group is centered around political activism and Islamic charity work. And of course, al-Banna's influence to becoming a teacher came from his father, Sheikh Ahmed Abdul al-Rahman. I think I'm saying that right. And the doctrine of the Hanbali Puritanism, this, as defined in the Salafist movement, defined the movement of Muslims who think back to like the earlier times and seek to return to the fundamentals of the Islamic faith and to live similarly like Muhammad and his companions did. But when the Ottoman Empire was abolished in 1928, al-Banna was still a student in Cairo. The WAFD party, I think I'm saying that correct, W-A-F-D, the WAFD party was a nationalist, liberal political party in Egypt. It was said to be Egypt's most popular and influential political party for the period from the end of World War I through the 1930s. And many who lived under the leadership of the WAFD party were dissatisfied, and they were, concerned about the promotion of secularism and its nationalist ideals. And this led to al-Banna to come to terms that a new concentration is needed for Egypt as a whole. I mean, the complaints of those against the WAFD party coincided with al-Banna, and it was here that al-Banna formed the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, there were like dozens of small disorganized Islamic groups at this time in the early 1930s, but these organizations tried to promote piety, engaged in charitable activities. But by the late 1930s, the Muslim Brotherhood had established branches in every Egyptian province. Even in the 1940s, it grew to like, I believe, 500,000 active members. The Brotherhood's stated goal is to instill the Quran and the Sunnah as the sole reference point for ordering the life of the Muslim family, individuality, community, and the state, as opposed to this pan-Arabist nationalist regime, the secular ideology.
Okay, so that's another factor that we haven't touched upon, where you've got these competing forces, right? On the one hand, the Muslim Brotherhood, who I think the saying goes, the Quran is the constitution, right? They want a theocracy,
right.
And on the other hand, you have a rising nationalist movement, because in charge, I believe it was King Farouk in charge in Egypt at the time, and he was kind of put there or supported by the British because he was subservient to British interests, and that's true of the region as a whole. That as the British were taking a less overt role in running it, they were leaving the kind of people in who would be subservient to their interest. And rising against that, on one hand, you've got the religious fundamentalists, and on the other hand, you've got secular nationalists who obviously are in some ways opposed, but have a shared goal of getting the foreigners out, right? So,
right.
How does that whole how does that whole situation play out then over the 40s and 50s, when you start to have these revolutions in Egypt and other Islamic countries?
Well, there were numerous nationalist ideologies that permeated the pan-Arabist world. Egypt, Syria, Iraq. These ideologies were seen as a threat to the Anglo-Saxon global elite of the United States and Great Britain. I could go into the change if you want. I'll talk about this how this changed, but I would think it came to a reaching influence where it was moved. I think in 1982, a 12-point document was created towards a worldwide strategy for Islamic policy. It was written by an Islamic scholar in Qatar named Yusuf al-Qaradawi. It was to implement a global caliphate on the earth,
mm-hmm.
in overshadowing the pan-Arabist nationalist movements, which were also seen as a direct affront, almost a secular ideology, which is, of course, as a means to fight off the fundamentalist regimes that would come after the end of the nationalist movements. But I'll just go into a little detail about al-Banna's writings.
Yeah. This is the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah.
What's that?
I'm just reminding people it's the founder. Al-Banna's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right. Yeah. His writings toward members of the Brotherhood too. And actually, al-Banna was not a fundamentalist by any means. He saw this change for a secular ideology, but he didn't consider jihad as a literal translation of physical jihad. He saw it as an inner movement within itself. He never engaged in terrorism. He forbidden it, actually. And after his death in 1949, in which he was assassinated along with his brother-in-law by two men who were waiting for, while they were waiting for a taxi, the death was blamed on King Farouk, in which you named before, who was, by the way, who was the 10th ruler of Egypt. He was said to have been blamed for the planning of the attack. But as of today, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is probably the oldest and largest Islamic organization in existence today. But the coincidence between the Muslim Brotherhood of today and yesterday is that al-Banna's movement, when he first started the Brotherhood, forbid violence.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they fought the colonist rulers of Great Britain, France, al-Banna claimed that the jihad of the heart was more important than the jihad of the sword, so to speak.
Right.
He advocated moral reform and advocated against the violent takeover of power. By the way, the Muslim Brotherhood had a wide-ranging influence, which gave rise to another Islamic poet and theologian named Sayyid Qutb. If you want, I'll get into
that would be great. I think we probably need to tell the story of Egypt a bit first, and the king, and then get into, because Qutb is coming in the 50s just after that, right? And Qutb's a very interesting guy, and I'd like to hear about him, in some detail, his trip to America and all. But I think talking about the revolution in Egypt and the relationship between Nasser and the Brotherhood and how that broke down and so on, and how the British play into it might be. If you could give that story, that would be great.
Right. The Egyptian U.S. Forming alliances with numerous pan-Arabist movements. This led to Gamal Nasser, or as they say, Nasserism. Gamal Nasser actually promoted a socialist Arab nationalist political ideology, which was in turn involved with the Egyptian Revolution in 1952. Gamal, I'll talk a little bit about the tenets of Nasserism. This is almost like this, like I said, it's an Arab nationalist political ideology. It combines elements of Arab socialism, republicanism, nationalism, anti-imperialism. The tenets of Nasserism is mindful of both the Islamic and Christian heritage of the Arab world, as with Baathism, which was predominant in Iraq at one point. It's a secular ideology, in other words. And the ideologies that were permeated from Gamal Nasser spread into other countries like Iraq and Syria. And this generally secular movement saw this as an affront to numerous religious fundamentalists who saw this as a threat to the ideologies of the Wahhabi mentality itself. And also, this also provided almost a problem for the Anglo-Saxon movement of the United States and Great Britain itself, which I'll get into a little bit later about what they promoted and how they tried to overthrow the nationalist ideologies of Egypt and Syria itself. But meanwhile, Nasser himself took over power after, I'm sorry, who came after Nasser himself?
Okay, King Farouk or Anwar Sadat?
No, the next president after Nasser.
Anwar Sadat?
Thank you very much. Anwar Sadat, thank you. Yeah, Anwar Sadat actually saw Nasser's almost pro-nationalist movement as too rigid, as too extreme. So what he wanted to do was create a more relaxed form of government. But what he did was that even though he tried to promote economic reform for the poor and for the moderate, he actually was for the affluent itself behind the scenes. And this caused an uprising within the country, a small uprising as well, which permeated to the bread riots of 1977. Immediately after this, he transitioned to a more egregious affront to the religious sector. He tried to build bridges with Israel itself and the United States. And this gave rise to the religious sector itself, which was, by the way, under persecution under Nasser and under Sadat himself. But I believe Nasser was a little bit more extreme. He jailed numerous high-ranking members of Al-Jihad, Jamaat Islamiyah, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and all these people who suffered enormous pressures on the jail. They were, some of them had their feet dismembered. There was numerous barbaric practices under Nasser himself. And they thought that with Sadat's presidency, he actually thought that he would be more lenient in his practices, but he was just as brutal. But the final straw came on the back of when he tried to alleviate and with the tension between Israel and the religious sector. And in 1981, he was assassinated by members of Al-Jihad. This saw the transition between this nationalist movement that permeated Egypt. Now you see this overthrow, this religious extremism that come basically under the Jamaat Islamiyah and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Numerous people were arrested. Numerous notable people like Ayman al-Zawahiri, Omar Abdul Rahman, the Blind Sheikh, who would go on to have later ramifications, especially for New York, during the 90s and the early 2000s. And what we're seeing also in Egypt today had even this ripple effect as you can see, the transition from the Pan-Arab nationalism that permeated Iraq and Syria, especially with Egypt, which we're talking about here, just Egypt. This transition to nationalism to religious fervor. Now that what comes after this religious fervor? Well, we've yet to see, because we still see. I mean, Ayman al-Zawahiri is still alive, but we just don't know where he is.
Okay, so back in this period of Nasser, you have a similar thing going on in Iran, where the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi Shah, his power severely diminished by Mohammad Mossadegh becomes the prime minister. So you've got these two secular nationalist figures. Okay, I'd just like to ask about the collusion between Western governments and radical Islam, because this is a theme that runs throughout the century then, and it's a theme that really escalates when we get into Afghanistan in our next talk. That's when it really gets ratcheted up a lot. But I think it's easy to understand in a country like Saudi Arabia, where the Islamists run the country, essentially, why you would have collusion between Western powers and Islamists, because they've got the oil, they're in charge, so they're the people you deal with. But I think to the average person looking at Egypt and Iran, you would think Western governments would have really be driven to relate to and perhaps be supportive of or encouraging of regimes like Mossadegh's in Iran, Nasser's in Egypt, because they're secular nationalists. Some of the excesses of torture in Nasser's Egypt aside, neither of those men would have looked out of place running a European country at the time. They'd fitted in there, and they seem to have the most in common with Western ideology. And yet you find this nationalist ideology is the one that Western governments are the most opposed to and are prepared to covertly support groups like the Muslim Brotherhood to overthrow and diminish, and to support and ally with the Saudis in diminishing nationalism. So could you talk about that perhaps? And in Iran, this led to a revolution, and in Egypt, it led to a short war where the British invaded. So could you pick up on that theme of why it is that there is this hostility towards these nationalist movements around the whole world, but particularly we're talking about the Middle East here, to the extent of allying with people who seem to have a very different kind of ideology than Western governments would pertain to?
Right. I think the problem stems from that there's the Anglo-Saxon global powers like Great Britain and the United States saw this unification of the nationalist ideology as a direct threat to expansionism in these countries, and that's because they on the Pan-Arabist level, they saw that they didn't need these imperial powers of Great Britain and the United States to dictate the nation's laws and regulations. They saw them as an unnecessary problem. The Pan-Arabist movement and the Arab nationalist ideology were not seen as viable assets to the foreign powers of the United States and Great Britain. They saw the unification of the Arab people as a growing and pertinent problem, which could cause an Islamic Ummah or a global unification of Arabs, which could threaten the Anglo-Christian identity in the future years. And I think I believe it was November 20th or 21st, 1952, the Colonial and Commonwealth Relations Office produced a document called The Problem of Nationalism, a branch of the British Foreign Office that saw this document was to safeguard Great Britain as a world power, particularly in the economic and strategic fields, against the inherent dangers of nationalism. As the Arab world became increasingly dismayed with the United States and Great Britain's determination for regional imperialism, the foreign powers decided to help overthrow the nationalist leaders of the more educated Arab nations. Ironically, they would be the Shiite nations, Syria, Iran. Uh, Thus, the oil-producing countries and the Arab nations would come under fire from the documents outlined, which saw nationalism as a direct threat to the Anglo-Saxon powers. And the effects from the Foreign Office document were immediately seen. For example, the Mau Mau uprising, which took place in 1953.
In Kenya.
Numerous indigenous peoples of Kenya had fought against the British imperialists and local auxiliary militia who were favoring the imperialists. The Mau Mau, by the way, had failed to capture widespread public support, and partly because of the British policy of divide and rule. The Mau Mau uprising created a rift between European colonial communities in Kenya and saw this abhorrent wave of violence that caused dissension between the indigenous populations, which are still readily seen today. And of course, also the Darul Islam Rebellion, which was a war waged between 1949 and 1962 by the Islamic State of Indonesia. I'm going to say this name wrong, it's a long name. Sekar Marjadan Karasaro, that's a long name. He was an Islamic mystic, which saw the nationalist Dutch imperialists as the enemy. He fought to gain independence from them in 1948, and after the war, he proclaimed the establishment of the Islamic State of Indonesia in 1949. He named himself the Imam, and his membership grew. Numerous supporters of the Indonesian military decided to switch allegiance, and members of the Darul Islam tried several times to assassinate Sukarno, who was the president of Indonesia.
Yeah, a nationalist, right, as well. So you have a similar spirit like Nasser and Mossadegh.
Well, he was under the nationalist movement under the Dutch for many years, Sukarno. But in 1956, Sukarno's government and its military went on the offensive against Darul Islam. And in 1965, Darul Islam was defeated. They were liquidated. But still, some members actually managed to survive. And believe it or not, some members of that group would later regroup and later form Jemaah Islamiyah, which is still present today. But to show you how the United States influence into this war, in 1965, Suharto, who became the second president of Indonesia, accused the Communist Party, the Indonesian Communist Party, or the PKI, of organizing a coup d'état, which was, of course, false, never happened. But over the months that followed, the systematic extermination of up to 1 million people who were affiliated with the party were liquidated. They were killed brutally. But it showed years later that it was the United States who backed Suharto. They did back Suharto's purge. And this came from came from the documents that were released under the FISA Accord. But, I mean, some elements within the U.S. government have been trying to undermine the overthrow of Sukarno, including the Indonesia's anti-colonial independence leader and the first president far before 1965. And this could, of course, leads into the Iranian president Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953.
Sure. Yeah. So well, just mention that one. Yeah.
Right. You want me to get into that a little bit?
Yeah. Just mention what we'll do is we'll talk about the Iranian Revolution. We'll just mention it, so we've got kind of presenting a narrative of what's going on, and then we'll move on to some of the effect this had on the Islamic world and the figure of Said Qutb and so on. So, talk about what happened. I mean, it's fascinating with what happened in Iran. So, talk about
on 19. Sure, recap. 1953, August 19, 1953, with the assistance of the Anglo-Saxon countries, United States and Great Britain, Iranian President Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in a classic coup d'état. Dubbed Operation Boot under Great Britain and Operation Ajax by the United States. They saw the strengthening of the monarchical rule led by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who is commonly known as the Shah of Iran. He took over power, which was believed to be the downfall of Mossadegh, because he actually sought to audit the documents of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or the AIOC, a British corporation. And he tried to limit the company's control over the Iranian oil reserves. And it was later revealed, many years later, that the CIA had funded Operation Ajax, which saw the Mohammed Mossadegh in prison for 3 years and under house arrest for the rest of his life. And this led to the monarchy of the Shah of Iran, who would later, of course, be overthrown in the Iranian Revolution in 1982.
So we'll move on to the revolution, because it's at the end of this, because it's kind of like the outcome of this. But essentially, the narrative we're seeing is that Western governments really dislike nationalist movements arising around the world. And they're prepared to ally with anyone with groups whose ideologies or the outcomes of those ideologies we might find counter to our own or even abhorrent. People who are prepared to commit massive amounts of violence and repression to put leaders in charge of these countries who will serve Western interest. And you see it with, we mentioned Suharto in Indonesia and Reza Pahlavi Shah in Iran, to get rid of the nationalists. And they're prepared to ally with, in the example we're setting, radical Islam to use it as a kind of tool or a proxy force. So I think in the example with, the British were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to bring down Nasser, and eventually there was an overt war in Egypt. And in Iran, it was the CIA agent on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt. I think he was Theodore's cousin, and was putting word around the mosques that Mossadegh was a communist. He was going to ban religion, attacking mosques. There were bombs going off at mosques, the idea that there was some communist revolution about to take place, really stirring up the radical Islamic elements to use them as a force to overthrow the Shah. Sorry, the Prime Minister Mossadegh, and bring in the Shah. Now, the radical Islamic elements do not necessarily get what they want in these revolutions, because you ended up with a dictatorial Shah who was far too secular for them too. But that's a theme that's going to run throughout these presentations. To what extent have Western powers been willing to use radical Islam as a kind of Frankenstein's monster to achieve geopolitical purposes? But then sticking with the Islamic narrative, there's this figure in the 50s in Egypt of Said Qutb, who's, I forget what he did for a living, but he was working in the United States, and then I think he was a fairly secular figure to start out with, went to the United States and started to have a lot of reservations about the way Western culture was going, and became a more hardline Muslim, wanting a Muslim society, and became a huge influence in everything that followed, including movements like Al-Qaeda after that. So would you talk through who Said Qutb is and his relevance and importance to the whole movement?
Right. You want me to give you a short rundown on Said Qutb itself? Yeah. Well, Said Qutb was born in 1906. He was born in the Asir Governorate of Egypt. A little bit about his father. His father was a known political activist and would hold weekly meetings to discuss political events, and he would have Quranic recitations in his house. And Said Qutb first learned about the recitations of the Quran, and it would fuel this artistic side of his personality, which would form later on in his later years. He memorized remarkably the whole Quran at the age of 10. I mean, was pretty impressive in its own right. Qutb in his teenage years became disillusioned with just religious studies, though, and because he saw the religious institutions as oppressive toward more secular education. His thoughts regarding the pressures of the religious sector and holding them in contempt, in which those institutions were used to form public opinion and thoughts, he believed were repressive. So Qutb moved to Cairo between 1929 and 1933. He ended his educational studies and his career as a teacher, and the Ministry of Public Instruction began. He was 24 at this time. He embarked on another adventure. He authored 2 books, and in early 1940s, Qutb would first encounter, and this is important, the works of Alex Carroll. Alex Carroll is a Nobel Prize-winning biologist and a surgeon, and he was actually highly critical of Western civilization. He believed that Western modernity immersed people in spirituality numbing, and he believed in control and discipline of the spiritual side of the human race, and that rather than building caring communities that cultivated attitudes of selfish individualism. But Qutb found Carroll's work profound. And this, he regarded him highly as a reasonable man who found that there was a difference between the spirit and the machine, which was the body. But an important aspect of Qutb actually happened between 1940 and 50. He actually went to the United States on a scholarship to study the educational system. He wanted to become a teacher. But at this time, Qutb was still westernized. According to his close friends in Egypt, the Saud family, he enjoyed Hollywood movies, and he actually dressed in that like a Western style of clothing. He visited major cities in the United States, spent time in Europe on his journey home, and actually on his return to Egypt in 1951, he would publish one book, and it was called The America That I Have Seen, where he became explicitly critical of things he observed in the United States. Qutb specifically spoke out against its materialism, its individual freedoms, racism, and he specifically hated boxing matches. He thought they were brutal.
Right.
He thought that the outward enthusiasm of sports was ridiculous. And he also noted that it had a strong support for the Israeli state, even as far back as 1952. That's important to note, that even that the Israeli state still had this permeate nationalism inside the United States. So it was here that he began advocating for an Islamic awakening spiritually in the Arab states. But because he feared this westernized style of living, which would spread abroad. And he saw this when he visited cities like Las Vegas, because he went there too. And what he didn't want was this westernized style of living to infect the hearts and minds of the Muslims. So in 1954, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood. Both Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood welcomed the coup d'etat of the government, actually. But he had a close relationship with Gamal Nasser at this time. He would actually visit him in his house for 12 hours a day, right, weeks at a time. But Nasser secretly set up the organization that would oppose the Muslim Brotherhood, and the organization was called the Tahrir. But Qutb had no knowledge of his existence, nor its stated goal, actually, and he still trusted Nasser. Once Qutb found out that Nasser's plan was to overthrow the Muslim Brotherhood, they went out and planning Nasser's assassination. Mm-hmm. But the plot was found out, and Qutb was jailed. But this would have enormous ramifications. He would author 2 books, and these would be the most important works in his history. The books would be called Millstones and In the Shade of the Quran. But Qutb was let out of prison in 1964 at the behest of the Prime Minister of Iraq. But for only 8 months, he was rearrested in 1965. And he was sentenced to death for his part in the conspiracy to assassinate Nasser. In 1966, Sayyid Qutb was hanged. But this martyrdom, so to speak, would have ramifications in the Arab world. And this would influence the Islamic Ummah as a whole, Sunni and Shia. His death had a direct influence on Islamic terrorist groups in Egypt and elsewhere. His influence, specifically on Al-Qaeda in years later, was felt through his writings, and those writings were the Millstones.
We'll come to his influence in just a sec. Just a couple of things that I understand about him was that, one, he was tortured when he was arrested.
Yes.
This had a big effect on him because up until then, he'd seen that Western civilization led to a kind of isolation and a selfishness, but then he came to believe that this direction Egypt had taken had led it to become brutal and evil, even that there's total dehumanization, because it was the CIA who had come in and had been teaching the enhanced interrogation technique, say, to Nasser's government, and that his martyrdom was just that, because Nasser tried to give him an out on a couple of occasions and back down in some way so he didn't have to hang him. But Qutb was aware that his words I think he actually said, my words will carry more weight if I die. And he was prepared to die for that reason. There's something sort of reminiscent of the death of Socrates about it. Was what I'm saying there accurate?
No, it is actually. He was tried to abscond the religious sector itself. Nasser actually did try to give him an out, and he actually tried to have him abstain from having future ramifications toward the government itself and Nasser itself, because he saw that the growing threat of the Muslim Brotherhood itself, because at this time the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't just the only Islamic organization that would threaten the government. He saw the Al-Jihad, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Gamma Islamiyya, and he saw these groups as growing in its ideology, and growing even outside of the even Cairo itself into other of the nondescript cities and towns. And so I think Nasser knew that if he could try to get Qutb to abstain just from overthrowing the government, he would leave him alone. But Qutb knew that even in death, his ideology would become much more almost like Star Wars, when Obi-Wan Kenobi says his death would only bring about the Force, the good force, the good side of the Force, even more power. Yeah. And I think Qutb saw this, and that's why he say that no, I will not refrain from the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. And actually, like I said, during his death, but before I noticed that you said he was tortured in jail. This is quite important, because when Sayyid Qutb was tortured, he wasn't alone. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was a doctor at the time, a surgeon, and also Omar Abdel Rahman, who would go on to have enormous ramifications, like I said, later on, al-Zawahiri as well. These guys were tortured for years. There's al-Zawahiri especially, who was a religious individual, but because of the torture, because of under the Iranian, the Egyptian secret police, who tortured him for 3 years, it gave rise to this extremist ideology of Zawahiri, this notion of being against the secular powers of nationalism, and this overthrow of governments, and implementing Qutb's work, because Qutb had an influence to Zawahiri, and Zawahiri even states in his works himself.
Okay, we'll come back to Zawahiri in a minute, because he's absolutely obviously crucial. Just to finish up or continue on with Qutb, there's an interesting distinction, I think, to be made between him and the Saudi Wahhabists, that the more extreme Wahhabists did not want any technological innovation beyond that of the 7th century, and perhaps they came round to it to some degrees, but introducing things like the telephone and the TV set to Saudi were a big challenge, because they didn't see any value in anything modern at all. Qutb wanted a modern society, but with Islamic values, so he wanted to embrace technology, right? And the other interesting thing then is how the ideology crossed the Sunni-Shia divide and was influential on Iranians at the time, to the point that we'll come on to the Islamic Revolution in around a minute, but Qutb was actually made it onto the postage stamp in the Islamic Republic, even though he's a Sunni Muslim. That divide got crossed. So maybe you could speak to his immediate influence then, right, on the influence his work had immediately on the Muslim world, and going forward from that point on modern Islamic groups.
Sure. I mean, well, better yet, Osama bin Laden actually stated that it was Sayyid Qutb's writings which influenced his notion of a growing Islamic caliphate. Ayman al-Zawahiri, he was a student actually of Qutb. He was also an ardent follower. He went on to become a member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Anwar al-Awlaki says he was also heavily influenced by Sayyid Qutb. These people, actually, the people I just mentioned, actually had such a wide influence, of course, with the Sunni Wahhabist ideology. But the irony is that Qutb actually initially stated that it was abhorrent to show Sunni violence upon the Shia minority. What he wanted was the Sunni and Shia divide to to liquidate. And what he wanted was the Islamic Caliphate, which was where both the Sunni and Shia divide to unify. And from there, grow the caliphate by overthrowing the secular ideology or the Western imperialism, by growing within the imperialist nature, especially in the book In the Shade of the Quran. He implies that in order for the global Islamic Caliphate to be successful, he states that slowly but surely the Islamic movement would have to permeate into the Western imperial countries, and the Arab population would have to populate. They would have to grow exponentially, and from there they would have to almost slowly integrate within the government institutions themselves, and they would change policy. They would write regulations favorable to Islamic countries and Islamic laws and Islamic culture, and from there they would grow, and they would assembly liquidate the Western imperialist nature, the secular threat, and this way they would saturate the global community of the Islamic Caliphate. However, this deviation, this deviation was not welcomed by the majority of the Sunni majority, which is most of the Muslims in the world are Sunni. Many Muslims became disillusioned with Qutb's work regarding this forced integration into secular societies. Many mainstream Muslims took issue with Qutb's contention that physical power or physical jihad had to be used to overthrow governments and attack societies. And they claimed Qutb as to be like this amateur scholar, and that he didn't know what jihad actually meant. And that goes back to the premonition of earlier Sunni scholars who saw jihad as a inner struggle more than this physical defense of jihad that we see today.
And that's a sense of perspective I want to maintain, because we are looking at the dark of the dark in some ways. Not to characterize people in cartoonish terms, but we are looking at the kind of thoughts that came into being and evolved that eventually gave you the wave of Islamic terrorism throughout the 90s leading to 9/11. But we're looking at that slice, right? And there's a wider Islamic world that's taking place in, which is in many ways very opposed to that slice, obviously. So I do want to maintain that sense of context throughout these conversations, because when we're not, when it's a different culture, I think it's a problem with the media in the way that on the sort of tabloid press, you always get, the extremist Muslims are the ones that ever make the front page, right? So, it's good to bear that in mind, that it's just the bit we're examining.
Right. The irony of this is that with the works of Sayyid Qutb and his use of his implementation of the Wahhabi ideology or the Salafist movement into the Sunni school of thought, the more extreme groups that we see today, like Islamic State in Levant or al-Nusra or Dar al-Islam or even Abu Sayyaf, they would consider Qutb as a moderate Muslim and they would kill him. So and a great example is Al-Qaeda during the Syrian uprising, Syrian civil war. They disassociated with the Islamic State, and because the Islamic State started killing Shia Muslims, Shiites and Alawites, they started slaughtering them wholesale. Al-Qaeda, even then, and them, an extremist group, Al-Qaeda, saw this as too extreme. So what we're seeing is the foundation for extreme Islam by the Wahhabi ideology, now implemented into the culture or the government of Western imperial powers by Sayyid Qutb, whose writings and motivations now influence the extreme right-wing orthodoxy of Islam, bin Laden, Ayman al-Zarqawi, Anwar al-Awlaki, and so forth. And their interpretation of those works now see this almost this quasi orthodoxy that we see with the Islamic State.
Okay, we'll go on to that escalation then, and maybe my thought of an entry point would be Ayman al-Zawahiri. If you want the right pronunciation of these names, listen to Adam and not me. So when I look at some of Qutb's early observations being in the United States, I think I can kind of relate. I think a lot of people can relate to the idea of society becoming too atomized and losing the sense of the spiritual, and everyone being too materialistic. And then obviously torture doesn't have a good effect on people, right? And so that seemed to take him in a worse direction. But what I'm saying is that there's a movement which, and particularly Hassan Bannan, the Muslim Brotherhood, you can relate to some of his thoughts on some of his thoughts on society. I think his brother is still alive. Actually, I've heard an interview with him where he said that they would talk and discuss things between themselves, and his brother was not as extremely as Islamic, and didn't have this vision of an Islamic society in the way Hassan did. But he could understand him, and they understood each other, and but things get worse with time and get more extreme with time, as I suppose these things tend to do. And maybe that brings us on to then this event that we've mentioned before, Anwar Sadat coming to power after Nasser in Egypt, and there being a change in Egyptian society, him not cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood and such as much. But it said he signed his own death warrant when he signed the peace accords with Israel. This was totally unacceptable. And indeed he was assassinated. And I'm not sure they were overtly members of the Muslim Brotherhood, were they? Because I think the Muslim Brotherhood tried to distance themselves to it, but they were Egyptian army officers who were Islamists, essentially. And after that, there was a roundup. This very prominent figure who becomes very prominent, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was thrown into jail, tortured. He was a doctor at the time, and he's now apparently the leader of this group, Al-Qaeda. We'll talk about them more in future sessions. But my understanding of it is that the Muslim Brotherhood believed that there might be this great uprising after the assassination of Anwar Sadat. Al-Zawahiri believed that, and then it didn't happen. And then there was this movement, along with the torture, of seeing, it's almost like this communist thing of false consciousness, right? That even Arab societies now have been hypnotized by the allure of the West, by the corruption of the West. And then people became legitimate targets. Civilians then became legitimate targets. Because it's a bit like what Morpheus says to Neo in the Matrix, of we want to liberate these people, but while they're in the Matrix, they're your enemies because they side with the system. So there was this movement of more extremism again through this central figure. Do you want to talk about what I've just said there, and Ayman al-Zawahiri and his role in this, and how he goes on to be this very, very central figure in Islamic terror, then how he comes about and what he develops?
Yeah, right. We see similar instances today where we have the CIA's torture program, which was whistleblown by John Kiriakou, where we're torturing people for information. And usually these people are low-level operatives within either Al-Qaeda or other Islamic organizations that don't have the necessary information that could give them a little bit more of an inside view of how Al-Qaeda works. And with Ayman al-Zawahiri being tortured, now remember, al-Zawahiri was, even though he came up a religious figure, he wasn't overtly religious. He wasn't an extremist by any means. He was a surgeon. He was actually, his family was well off. And he wasn't like an extremist, so to speak. It's almost like they made him into an extremist because of the years and years of torture that he was under by the Egyptian secret police. Now, of course, he wasn't involved in the assassination of Anwar Sadat, actually. It was actually the group called Al-Jihad. The members of Al-Jihad actually were arrested, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, the leader of Al-Jihad at the time, he was actually arrested for, I think, 8 years. And he was actually released, I believe. And numerous people of Al-Jihad and also the Egyptian Islamic Jihad actually left for Pakistan and Afghanistan. And actually those people actually later on had a direct influence in the 1979 Afghan war, which we'll talk about
Yeah,
another
sure,
time.
sure.
Actually, they have a direct influence in that war. So it's almost like a puzzle piece. You'll see like these people have an influence with the assassination of Sadat. They actually have, and these people actually flee, and they have an influence in radicalization that's going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So when these people flee into Pakistan and Afghanistan and into Syria, all these people that were involved with al-Jihad and the Egyptian Islamic, they're now permeating those ideologies within the countries that were now that were once nationalist countries are now seeing the effects of this religious extremism, which we are still seeing today, by the way. I mean, Syria is still trying to fight the Islamic Levant, Islamic State in Levant. They're winning only because of the coalition of Russia and Turkey. Turkey now is seen as the extremist groups. They're actually against the Syrian Assad government. But look who is funding the Islamic extremists in Syria, the United States, and as well as Israel as well. So what was going on in countries like Iraq, in countries like Egypt, in countries like Syria? These nationalist countries now have devolved into these religious fundamentalists supported by the United States and the Western imperialist power because they're easier to defeat, and of course gives rise to the war machine, which is always rolling on forward. And because there's always a need for war, and because of the direct threat that the religious fundamentalists pose to the Western ideologies of Great Britain and the United States, and of course the need for the threat to overuse the military industrial complex to keep this war going on.
Okay, yeah. So I mean that as I said before, massively ratchets up in the 1980s with the Afghan war, and that's what we'll come on to next time. Perhaps we could finish this discussion by talking about Iran in 1979 and the consequence. It's because it's maybe the first time where the chickens came home to roost, so to speak. This support for the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists in the country, in fomenting a revolution in 1953, even though that revolution didn't directly bring the Islamists to power, it's where dissent fermented in the mosques in the following decades then, and that had this direct consequence. The destabilization of society in the 50s led to this second revolution in 1979, where we ended up with an Islamic theocracy. So maybe you could just explain that a bit. I mean, obviously you could explain that for 10 hours, but
sure.
Just in terms of how that linkage that we're drawing between Western support for Islamic fundamentalism and how we've ended up with an Islamic State.
Right, in Iran. Right, well, because of the overthrowing of Mossadegh and which showed the monarchical rule under Mohammad Pahlavi, who's the Shah of Iran. It's almost like they knew that the country would descend into the power of the religious sector. If you get rid of the secular nationalist ideology, there has to be a replacement in school and train of thought by the public. So what they did was the CIA actually fermented the belief that Mossadegh was not for the people, and that Pahlavi would show a more favorable position for Western imperialism. This actually overthrew the people into almost like a civil war between the religious sector and those of the nationalist sector, because the nationalist people actually fled Iran, and the remaining people that were under Mossadegh's rule, the remaining public, were almost over the years were seemingly eliminated by the religious fervor that was growing. And I think the CIA, I'm going on a stretch here, I think the CIA knew this. I think they knew that in order to destroy the secular ideologies that the government, the nationalist movements within these countries like Iran and Syria and Iraq, and implemented with the religious fervor, it would be easier to control. And we saw that in 1979 when the Shah of Iran was overthrown by the religious supreme leader. I forgot his name.
Oh, Khamenei.
Ali Khamenei.
Yeah.
Right. And so when Khamenei actually saw the Shia uprising, he knew that the nationalist fervor was dying. He saw it as a replacement. And he saw that the Western imperial powers were trying to move in. And he saw that the effects of the Israeli government, the right-wing government, the Likud party, actually tried to implement this new fervor, tried to back the Shah of Iran, but it was too late because the religious sector saw this as an affront to the country itself, and they said, no more, we'll overthrow the country, we'll overthrow the government, and we'll implement the religious ideology of Khamenei itself. And then he himself became the sole power of Iran. And this became the real threat, not the nationalist government of Mossadegh. Mossadegh actually was seen as the threat for Great Britain and the United States only because he wanted to regulate the imperial powers of Great Britain and the United States. But now with him gone, it's much easier to defeat and overthrow a religious ideology, right? All you have to do is send in the military, and the Iranian military is, of course, of no power or no threat to the United States itself. But you just can't go and overthrow a country. It's not that easy, although some people like to believe it. You would have to have the backing of the people. And the people itself don't want war. I mean, generally, the public really don't want war. And with Iran's religious authority now, we still now, even they have a religious religious authority that governs the country to help, almost like a Saudi Arabia, but not as extreme. But with the elimination of the nationalist sector now, what are we seeing today? I mean, even today, with the just in the Shia nations, just with Syria, Lebanon, Iran, we're seeing Libya, Syria, and Iran wrought with this sectarian violence that was brought upon by who? United States, Great Britain, and Israel, and of course Saudi Arabia, who's funding these madrasas to pump out these extremists at such an exponential rate. But but in their eyes, the religious sector sees death as the gateway to paradise. But the Western imperial powers don't care, right? They're easily replaceable. As long as the threat of the religious ideology is always present, we can always have a military invasion of these countries and overthrow the government's institutes. I mean, the perfect example is Syria. I mean, and they don't even hide the fact that we're funding groups like the Islamic State, now Nusra, or Dar al-Sam anymore. I mean, but the people don't care. I mean, the people who actually want, they believe that Bashar al-Assad is the threat. Instead, I mean, you have military people going on Twitter, holding signs above their faces, saying, "I didn't sign to support the Islamic."
That's the outgrowth of this 70-plus year policy, right? And we'll move further into that.
Sure.
For sure. So it is just, to me, it was one of the first sort of geopolitical issues I became aware of, was this this thing that had happened in Iran, right? And it's just an absolute travesty that you have movements for Iranian liberation from Iranian people going back to at least the beginning of the 20th century. You can see groups of that. And maybe they kind of had it, right, in the 50s. Like, obviously, I have no idea. I don't have an alternative Earth and an alternative Iran to see what would have happened if Mossadegh had stayed in power. But there was this secular nationalist who seemed, as good for the country as any of our Western governments are. And that could have been the course for Iran then, right? And the reason there was the energy for a revolution in 1980 was the Shah was a dictator, and it was perceived that he was wasting the oil money on American military equipment and other boondaggles, and he had his torture chambers there for any dissenters. So even among secular Iranians, there was a want for a change of leadership, and that just the Islamists took over that, and that they have their societal support too, obviously. But it's not in your interest or my interest, or in the interest of any of the population of Western countries, to have either a monarchical dictatorship or an Islamic dictatorship in Iran, right? It would be much better for us if the country had stabilized and taken on more secular values in the 50s and more kind of freedom in that regard. So it's an absolute travesty what's happened there, and has happened around the world, and it cited Indonesia and so on. And these countries, there was this opportunity to move into a more peaceful world, and a more modern world after the Second World War, and we really didn't take it. Okay, it got whacked, and one of the ways it got whacked was from this use and abuse of Islam and Islamic fundamentalism, and yeah. So we've told that story. I suppose a small part up until around 1980. You might have some final words, Adam, but we'll kind of cut it there and then come in, because everything ratchets up with relevance to 9/11. Like the 1980s is just the decade where it all comes from, really, with the situation in Afghanistan and the subsequent wars that grew out of that, where countries started overtly using Islamic fundamentalists as a proxy force to fight their wars. Right. We see a continuation of that today, and that leads to this wave of terrorism in the 90s. So do you have anything you would like to add to this particular recording, Adam, or shall I pick it up with you next week or whenever for the next installment?
I'll just add a little bit later. With now between the era of 1940 and 1950, when we had this almost this Middle East, almost this awakening, a revival of sorts of education and liberalism that was permeating in countries like Syria, in countries like Lebanon, in countries like Iran, Iraq, that saw like there's almost a hegemony between the Sunni and Shia divide. Even though there was a tenuous relationship there, it wasn't as extreme as we see today. With the slow destabilization of these countries by Western imperial powers, we now are witnessing the slow effects of that into what we're going to talk about next, which is the Afghanistan-Russian Civil War, because Russia now sees what is happening, that is that Great Britain and the United States are now vying for power in the Middle East. And what is the main course for power? War. It's oil, and oil reservoirs that are dominating the region of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, Syria. All these countries have a geopolitical military strategy for the United States, Israel, Great Britain, and Saudi Arabia. It's also very important to acknowledge as well. Saudi Arabia sees countries like Syria and Iran as the enemy, only on the religious level, because they're such a orthodox Sunni Salafist country. They would like to see the United States, the Western imperial powers, use their military to slowly destroy the countries that are a direct threat to them, and that they themselves can be the supposed power of the Middle East region, which they're not going to be. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the weak link between the triumvirate powers, or the three conglomerates: United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Once, I think in the future, once Saudi Arabia is seen as more of a problem than what they're worth, then you'll see the wheels come off, and then you'll see more of an internal struggle. And I think we're going to see that soon, within the next 25 years. Also, we'll see a transitional power between the Arab states and the Western imperial powers. And I think Israel, soon enough, will enter the war with Iran. But that's for another discussion as well. Sure. But, I think it's very important to notice that it's not just a geopolitical strategy. It's also dealing with religious divide, the Sunni-Shia divide, as well as a military conquest of the region itself, strictly just for the Western imperial powers and Israel itself, who can expand their borders. Usually, people just want to see this as just a simple-minded. It's just for war. It's just for religion. It's a combination of all what I just needed, just about. And what will this lead to? All this, the nationalist overthrow of these countries. We'll see all these religious sectors finally convening into Afghanistan, and then we'll see how the United States uses them as a proxy to defeat the Soviet imperialist powers, and then we'll see the real power for the struggle for global power begin.
And that's where we'll go next time. So thank you very much, Adam. and thank you everyone for listening. If you have any comments or questions for Adam on this presentation, or any questions you would like me to put to him next time when we talk about Afghanistan, leave a comment on whatever platform and I'll pick up on that. And next time we're off to Afghanistan to look at all the different aspects there, we'll of course be going to Pakistan because of that heavy involvement. We might touch on the narco-trafficking elements in the Afghan war too. And at some point, be it next time or in a future one, we'll examine double and triple agents and if everyone is really who they claim to be in these kind of conflicts, and who's really working for who, because there's a lot of questions without easy answers get brought up about that kind of thing. So that's where we're headed. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you for having me on, Richard.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.